Okay, I think we're all set.
All right, everyone, welcome. So this is the second portion of the CTE Writing Across the Curriculum workshop series. So in this workshop, you go ahead and change that. We're going to skip over one. There we go. We're going to first kind of talk about what does your discipline value in writing. We're going to do a little bit of a brainstorming session in terms of figuring out what it is your discipline values in writing. Then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how do you assign writing, what is the purpose, how is writing aligned to outcomes, and then how do you create writing goals for your students. So, all right, and so
Better audio if I move over.
okay. And so then that's going to move us on to our rationale and goals. And so part of this rationale is to develop a culture of writing at University of Findlay built on research and disciplinary values and expectations. We also want to make sure we are engaging faculty from across disciplines in promoting and providing students with multiple writing experiences and diverse audiences, both formal and informal writing, and to also help faculty develop writing opportunities for students that are authentic and promote writing transfer. So if we go to the next slide. Okay. We're going to start for a second by taking about 3 to 5 minutes or so for you to take some time to brainstorm. And I want you to consider the following kind of questions or kind of writing values and expectations in your discipline. So take 3 to 5 minutes and write down what your discipline values in writing. Now you can create a list that addresses the following or more. Does your discipline value collaborative or single authored work? What about tense? What about research methods? What format does your discipline value? What about citation practices? Or does your discipline allow for the use of personal pronouns? Or do they want it as objective as possible? And then anything else that you can think of. So take about 3 to 5 minutes to just brainstorm some ideas on what you think your discipline values in writing and why. All right, take about another minute to finish up your thoughts. All right, so we're going to take a second stop here. So let's just hear a couple kind of disciplinary writing expectations from a couple people, and then we will kind of move on to reflecting a little bit more about those particular expectations. So anybody willing to share a little bit about kind of what your discipline values in writing?
I can get us started. So I am certainly speaking from English, but as a subfield, or maybe even a subfield in rhetoric and composition, look thinking even more about digital studies and multimedia composing. So within that domain of English, I would say that we value collaborative writing, particularly across demographics. So having a professor early stage with a late stage professor and a grad student or someone from outside the field, whether another discipline or even from the industry. We value open access journals, and we have strong support of non-traditional and born digital scholarship. So things that others might not quite recognize as scholarship, which is really fun during tenure promotion to explain. So as such, we value and encourage multivocal texts that resist prioritizing correctness in language usage over meaning making. So in other words, it's intentional, it's acceptable. We've had articles published in African American vernacular English, specifically using quote incorrect grammar to make points about language. And we also recognize that writing is more than alphabetic texts, and so we value the first person, both in terms of language, but also first-person experience as part of research methodology. So lots of things that don't resemble writing and research in other disciplines, for sure.
Other thoughts?
And if that didn't come through the Zoom audio, Chris Denneker said that, not to be flipped, but it just depends on the audience. And so anything's permissible if it's appropriate to the purpose audience.
Anything online? You type in the chat or speak out.
I shared in the chat that my discipline values APA 7. So, you look at all that list of things and that jumps out to me. We also have the American Educational Research Association Code of Ethics, as well as standards for reporting, which kind of guide a lot of the things that Harley was just speaking to as well.
And that sounds like a disciplinary top-down, something that would be very much field encompassing.
Yes.
Is that correct? Yeah. I think to Chris's point about it depends, when I think about some of these differences, it really seems like it's journal to journal, and that there's just nothing that binds our field together.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of our journals actually, when you go to submit, they require us to say that we've adhered to the Code of Ethics and the standards for reporting.
Yeah. That's, Courtney, I saw you come online. Do you want to add? Oh, you're muted, Courtney.
Sorry, I muted myself. I'm team writing too, and I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. And one way I create a metaphor in my brain is that like writing is really the chessboard and not the pieces. Right. And so many disciplines, whether they're talking to each other or within their field, are moving those pieces across the board with various strategies, and they're not as often thinking about the board. And so, but I like to help people think about the board, especially when it comes to teaching my students, because writing is such a fraught experience for them. you know, where we use words like collaborative, and, you know, they said like writing on my team can sound very utopian when I think people's previous experiences are pretty dystopian. But with the advent of like AI writing tools, like it feels like the utopia and the dystopia are very present for everyone. Like that conversation, which seemed pretty off in the corner, is now being had, you know, in my news feed broadly. So that's interesting. Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about lately. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, not to get too far afield, but I think that the question of who gets to participate in some of these less traditional things is important to not let go of when we think about what can we do versus what we're asking our students to do. I was just at our field's largest conference, and at the end of a presentation from a tenured professor, he said, out of ethical reasons, I am not citing anything in an Elsevier journal here. Here's the rest of my references. And I was just floored by that, and I understand because I don't know the argument, but also I was like, boy, we would never allow our students to have an ethical quandary of therefore they don't cite something, you know. But it's a privilege that an established person in our field might have to write in a different language or tense or style, publish something we may not value from a new scholar for emergency.
Anybody else have any other thoughts or to share?
Type of writing, again, your audience, type of audience when we're communicating in an email, again, kind of verge on to writing or almost documenting, or where your style is very different. Some of the communication that come out with the merger, how you then block out the text, you put it by that. You know, so just thinking about even approach, depending upon what messages and who. And it seems like we do a lot of that, you know, as staff. You know, it's not so much, but I think all of us do some of that too as part of our normal communications too. How you set up so that it's clear to the audience.
Yeah, and I think that's an important component too, that oftentimes isn't acknowledged by faculty, is the writing that occurs outside of publication, like the writing that occurs in emails, the writing that occurs in memos, stuff like that, that it happens every day that's not published widely for folks to see, but that everyday kind of communication that takes place is very important too within the field and how a particular field communicates with one another. So it's surprising that when I ask students, like, what type of writing are you doing? Some of them mention, like, oh, journal articles. I'm like, well, what about emails? What about text? What about memos? What about all of those? And they're like, that's writing? Yes, that's writing as well. That's all writing that's going to be expected in your field. So knowing how to communicate in various ways is very important too. So going beyond just those academic genres that we have to the everyday communication that we have. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so let's take some time, and I want you to, I have a QR code here for you to take a look at some examples from colleagues elsewhere about writing guides about what various disciplines actually value in writing, okay? So you're gonna find two options here. You're gonna find Miami University of Ohio, where they have some writing guides for various disciplines. And then you're also gonna find Appalachian State University, which has a lot of writing guides for you. So these are QR codes that will take you to the Miami University of Ohio or Appalachian State University. So I want you to take about 3 to 5 minutes, and I want you to peruse through these guides and see what it is disciplines value, or maybe you want to go to your own discipline and see what other colleagues are saying. Hey, this is what we value in computer science, or this is what we value in composition. Okay, so take about 3 to 5 minutes and peruse through these to see a little bit about what other colleagues are saying about writing expectations. might take about another minute to finish perusing through. All right. So what are some things that we noticed from these disciplinary guides, whether they are from your own discipline or from other disciplines? What did you notice?
How writing
I looked at the geography one on Miami and was really excited to see the way they were talking about threshold concepts and that was explaining the function of these kinds of writing before it even gets into what were the formal features that we might value. So just in terms of articulating for students why the approach writing in a certain way in this discipline, I thought that was really clear and helpful.
but like studying wisely, study this practices from our standpoint.
Right.
But I also all these things that we could
Yeah.
know anything about the news or
I learned about the Appalachian State page of their writing about guides through a night at the CEA conference where someone was presenting. They just rolled these out. And so there wasn't any kind of quantifiable data there, but anecdotally, they were explaining that, yeah, it's been tremendously helpful, particularly not just for students who are writing those disciplines, but for writing center staff and for faculty to also use that language articulate. So almost as a resource for those assisting with writing as much as someone might be looking for.
Yeah, to add to that as well, I know Miami University of Ohio, for example, these guides are actually created through a semester-long seminar class that faculty take. So faculty are required to take these courses in groups. It's not a singular professor that can take it. So you have to take it in groups. And then through that course, you learn about threshold concepts, you learn about writing and kind of theories of writing, so on and so forth. And then the end product is that disciplinary guide that comes out of that seminar for faculty. The same thing also happens too. At least it did. I'm not sure if it's still happening, but at North Carolina State University as well, they do something very similar in the sense that they have faculty seminars where faculty take a class. They meet once a week for about an hour or so. And then they kind of pull over writing threshold concepts and they develop a plan for how students are going to actually implement this type of writing in classes. Another key kind of program that I think is very important is the Writing and Rich curriculum at the University of Minnesota. That program actually has faculty both develop a curriculum plan for students, but also requires the faculty to assess at the end of every 3 years that program and their progress in meeting those goals that they've set out for them. So in a lot of ways, I find that these guides, in many ways, are really helpful for faculty, more so than students. In the simple fact that faculty are able to sit there and reflect mostly on what it is our discipline actually values in terms of writing. And I remember, for example, talking with Elizabeth Portal once, that it's surprising that faculty actually look at these guides and think about them. They are flabbergasted by some of the actual disciplinary writing requirements. They're like, why do we do this? This doesn't make any sense. So getting faculty to think a little bit more about kind of why do we do this? What's the importance to it behind it? I think really makes it clear for faculty to then go into the classroom and teach those writing requirements. Because they're more aware of it. Because, you know, as we get through our career, we just got to get used to it as faculty. It's just kind of commonplace. But putting ourselves back into the shoes of the student is really important as guides. So, yeah, Miami University of Ohio, Appalachian State University, as well as the Writing Acrost the Curriculum at the University of Minnesota are all great examples of how these curriculum guides or even these writing guides help faculty teach and incorporate writing into their curriculum. So, and I saw Courtney had her camera on, so I'm not sure if she wanted to add anything.
Anyone else online want to weigh in?
I was
Sean?
kind of surprised that in the education, when I looked at Appalachian State and they had all those the list, and I clicked on education, and it was I guess I was thinking I would get another like reference list or another list that included some of the guidance documents that are in education. So it's interesting just to see other people's perspective, right, of what they perceive as the guidance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also, when we mentioned like the Miami University of Ohio one, the teacher education one, mentioned a focus on like social justice and that as being part of the teacher education. But there was also no mention of the educational guidelines that you. So I found that interesting. That particular university defined writing in terms of their approach.
Right, exactly. Which is kind of interesting.
All right, wonderful. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so I think we've already done this a little bit, talking about whether we agree or disagree with some of these things. So we've already done this part of reflection. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens in 104 and 106, just to give you an understanding of kind of where students are coming from and when they start working into general education courses as well as into their disciplinary courses. So as you can see here, we have some major assignments in English 104 and English 106. You can take a look at those. So in English 104, our heavy emphasis here is summary analysis, as well as quote and paraphrase integration. Are some of the key skills that we focus on here. Obviously, other skills are coming up, but these are the main ones that we try to focus on. And then you can see the evaluation for both English 104 and 106 is the midterm as well as portfolio and task stream. And then the pedagogical strategies that we'd like to use in 104 and 106 are both scaffolded assignments, key terms, as well as revision in conferences with students. Now, obviously, this takes place in a little different way for each instructor as to what they prefer. But you can see here that we focus really on analysis within 104 and then trying to bridge that analysis with synthesis and argument in English 106. Okay, so we have our sample assignments there, so on and so forth. So if you go to the next slide. All right, so on the next slide, you can actually take a look at my English 104 and 106 assignment sheets here by clicking on this, by using this QR code. So that's going to take you to a Google file, a Google folder for English 104 as well as English 106 that provides you with a breakdown of how those assignments look, as well as what the assignment sheet was contained on the assignment sheets. I will say the assignment sheets are heavily influenced by QM or quality matters in the sense of the way that it's structured. How does this potentially help you to pick up on this in other disciplinary contexts? So, all right.
All right, so Dr. Sherman's already talked about this. I guess I'm just going to add to it a little bit. So as we already know, English 104 assignments are very much focused on teaching analysis as a concept. So really what we're trying to get students to do in that course is we're trying to get them to understand, okay, what is analysis? How do I analyze a text? How do I analyze a primary source, a secondary source, whatever? Just because that genre, like analysis itself, it's probably something that students have done, but it's probably not something they're super familiar with doing in an academic context. So, students, they probably analyze movies, video games, football games, whatever, stuff like that, but they don't understand how to take those skills they already have and apply them to an academic context. Because a lot of them have this experience with writing before college that isn't super friendly to the ways that people write in college. And that's not to say high school English teachers don't try, of course they do. But there is the kind of this general framework a lot of times where if you're teaching in a primary school environment, there's this attitude of conservation, shared and conservation, where values and ideologies and concepts within the community are trying to be preserved. And that oftentimes will transfer over into a student's schooling before college. And when a student gets to college, the fundamental framework for academic inquiry, well, it becomes inquiry. It goes from conservation to inquiry, where now ideologies, concepts, ideas, they're all of a sudden up for question. Your goal is to actually critically engage with them and figure out, okay, is this the truth or is this not the truth? Is there even a truth on this? So there's this big move happening from conservational to inquiry-based discourse when student moves from primary education into college. And being able to teach analysis, teach them to apply their analysis skills to this academic writing is a major goal we have in 104 to help them make that shift. And then, of course, academic discourse community, that's probably a term we should hear right now, or by now. That's kind of what we're initiating students into. And then, of course, the inquiry-based framework is a fundamental part of the academic discourse. And that's why a lot of times, so I know we've had this conversation internally as like, we have some professors who are like, okay, but do you guys teach students to write in English for 6 months? What they're referring to is grammar mistakes. And it's not that we don't focus on grammar at all in these courses. Like I know I can speak to Dr. Sherman's one of the course because I co-taught with him, is that grammar is a small part of the grade. It was like, yeah. It's still there, but like, our much bigger focus is this upper level, like, can we move you from this conservational mindset to this inquiry-based mindset? And can we teach you how to apply those analysis skills into this new inquiry-based mindset? And then the Writing Center actually, in some ways, it picks up the threads from English 104, 106 and kind of helps the student return to them again and again as they go through their academic career. So, of course, at the Writing Center, again, grammar isn't taboo at the Writing Center. Students like, I really want help with my grammar and APA citations, like we do that a lot, right? But we really try to encourage this more focus on global revision. So like, does your thesis statement make sense? Do you actually explain your thesis statement? Does your thesis statement match up with your paper, like when you're writing your paper? So we really focus on the structure of the argument, the larger organization of the argument. We always kind of try to steer students towards that if we can. And then another big part of that too is actually helping students understand assignment sheets and also feedback from their instructors. So assignment sheets, sometimes students might look at them and not quite know what the instructor wants. So we try to help them out with that. We also try to help them talk to you all. Sometimes we help them write emails to you and stuff when they don't think to ask you until, we're like, hey, did you ask them, So definitely helping them understand that assignment sheet. And then that itself is actually kind of a meta way to point them back again to discourse community, to analysis, to go like, hey, remember the framework that you're engaging this with. And then finally, something the Writing Center we like to do is kind of this gradeless environment. Now, obviously, the biggest reason for that is that grading is your job, not ours, so we don't do that. But also, grades can, we need to evaluate student progress somehow, but also grades a lot of times produce a lot of anxiety. I'm sure we're all familiar with student anxiety coming from the potential for not getting the best grade. So at the Writing Center, while ultimately those things that students bring into us are going to get a grade from their instructors eventually, we really try to avoid talking about grades in the Writing Center. We actually try to avoid evaluating language entirely. So we encourage consultants to scrub good, bad, strong, weak words like that out of their vocabulary entirely, if at all possible. Just because we want students to focus more on engaging with that discourse community, focus them back to making these moves of analysis and argumentation and stuff like that, so that over time they can become writers that are more engaged with that discourse.
slide here. That's what it should look like. So when we talk about how do we then, with all of those things in mind, assign writing in effective ways, and then eventually comment on those and help shape what our students are doing, we think it should always go back to backward design, right? And so asking these questions in this order, what do I want my students to be able to do at the end of the course? How can I measure their ability to achieve those outcomes? What assignments will allow them to demonstrate those that I can measure? And then what are the scaffolding activities that will help them develop the skills to be able to effectively demonstrate that outcome that I can measure? So that's all well and good. But then that next step that is important is how am I articulating this process to them? So is it explicit and concrete for them? Do they know why they're writing the course? And then, of course, by extension, do I know why they are writing my courses? And with those things, you know, if we're in the academic discourse community, then we say, well, you're just going to have to write a lot because people in academics write a lot, right? So if we're missing a clear articulation of why this particular outcome is best supported or demonstrated through a writing task, that transfer is not going to happen either. So that clarity is really key, both for the student and for the instructor. So to take an example from English 104, one of the things that we want to do, recognizing what was already described about these different frameworks, we want to help students move from writing summary to writing analysis. That's part of our goals in English 104. So a measurable project would be giving them the opportunity to analyze a primary source through a primary source analysis paper, straightforward. So the activities then that support that, we practice analysis together in class, we create discussion board posts that highlight textual elements, we do think, pair, share, we analyze analyses and see how other folks are doing it. And honestly, the practicing analysis, the think, pair, share, analyze analyses, these do not have to be writing activities, yet they can still help with scaffolding that analysis. And so then our articulation here is to make sure that students clearly understand the purpose of analysis, going back to the function, not just the formal features. Why is it useful? How does this transfer not only across disciplines in academic writing, but more broadly, when we talk about analyzing things we consume, media information literacy, right? Not falling for misinformation or disinformation. So that might be one way that we would scaffold a real traditional writing assignment to achieve a measurable outcome. So as we think about what those goals are, I love this example of the lion taming. One of the things that lion tamers have said, that the way that this works, they have the whip in the chair, right? And the whip is for the audience. It's not for the lion. The chair is what allows them to do this, because the chair has 4 legs and the lion gets confused by which of these legs to focus on. By trying to see too many things at once, it becomes uncertain of itself and it backs down. And so I think too often, if we're not being careful about how to point students to specific parts of the assignments we're giving them, the same kind of thing can happen, sort of that paralysis of analysis. So something that I try to incorporate in my writing projects is to emphasize some elements and de-emphasize the others, for each project. So rubrics, as Sean mentioned in the Writing Center, helping students understand the assignment prompt and teacher feedback. Part of that is using the rubric to indicate what's important in this particular assignment about writing, right, about this project. Students will sometimes complain a bit that, well, I did a lit review for them and they wanted this, and now I'm doing a lit review for this person and they want something different. And they're missing perhaps the genre of a lit review. What is it functionally doing? I like Courtney's metaphor of the chessboard versus the pieces, right? So the rules of the field dictate what this text is supposed to do, though the pieces might move differently in each game. So using those rubrics to emphasize some. Another important part of this development is providing low and no stakes writing situations, tasks. And then we can offer multiple ways for students to demonstrate learning skills and knowledge. We don't have to overwhelm them with a heavy stakes, high stakes writing assignment every time, in which they're supposed to have good sources and great integration and strong language, clear organization, and a solid thesis, and on and on and on. So by the weight that we assign these different things in the rubric, or not at all, those are some great ways that we can scaffold writing. So, for example, English 106, we want to move students after 104 from writing analysis into writing synthesis. And so one of the tools that I use is a 10-source literature review, so they can get some practice doing that kind of integration and learning what a lit review is designed to do, how does it function. So I offer several no low and high stakes projects that scaffold this. So one thing I do in all my courses, all my writing courses, is we have 5 minutes of timed writing at the beginning of the day that generally has nothing to do with the subject material, but it's truly about developing muscle memory of being able to sit down and draft quickly, because we're going to move toward a large project. Getting the thing done is important. And so getting some practice every day, sitting down and writing on command, scaffolds that. Introducing them to sentence templates, or some people call those sentence stems, the way that we can give them some language that helps shortcut the learning process of how do I put these sources in conversation with each other. So giving them some templates that they can, sort of like Mad Libs, just plug in their specific details. I also like using shared Google Docs where students can log in together and write at the same time and get some practice writing with each other, writing synthesis. And then some low stakes, things they might get a few points on, things where they have to kind of be a little bit more public about it. Discussion board posts, doing some practice in the homework, think, pair, share. And on all of these first 6 items, I would really care very little about grammar, right, or about specific things. This is about the moves rather than the polish at the end. And then finally, the high stakes at the end. We've had lots of practice. Then they can write an annotated bibliography, start learning what's important in each source. The literature review matrix just simply asks them to identify relationships between their sources and gaps, and then find the final literature review where all of these different elements become important in the final draft. I don't know, is this one of whose slide is this? Okay, very good. Does this one also come last? Did we delete some things? Needed to delete some things. All right. Are we at the end already?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah. This is what you get the week before the last week class.
yeah, so I guess now we can kind of offer up if anybody has any kind of questions or thoughts or anything like that, we can open the floor for those online or in person.
Now that you laid out 106, how do you then think about how you scaffold for then the next either a disciplinary related assignment that's something that's asked you to stick with, or maybe another type of writing? But what would be, how do you think about then scaffolding to the next beyond the 106 if someone's asked you to stick with them?
Yeah, but yeah, I was going to say in my classroom, I really put a lot of emphasis on making sure students are metacognitively aware of various situations. And it's I'm very transparent when I say, this is what I expect in a literature review, but know that if you move into a biology course or you move into a history course, that may be totally different. Okay, so making sure they are aware that these kind of conventions that we have in 106 are going to be different elsewhere. And that's something that they're going to have to expect. So making sure that they are aware of those. But in terms of working directly with somebody, the next thing that I would mention is, as Harley mentioned previously, the whole goal with writing transfer research, and that is making sure we are transparent with students about why we're asking students to do specific things, but also making it clear to students when they need to do something. Like, for example, reflection. Reflect on what you did in 106 and how is that different from what I'm expecting from you here. So asking students to, again, go back to what they've learned previously to then think about how they can apply that, what they've learned, to this new context or this new situation. So in many ways, it's reflection, going back, and then also just being transparent with the students and letting them know why you are expecting specific things. Is it because the discipline values this? Is this something that you are placing emphasis on? And maybe part of it is also that the instructor is using this as like a building block to help in a capstone course. And if that's the case, make sure the student knows, like, we're really going to focus on the methods section here, developing a solid methods so that you are aware of how to do that when we get to capstone.
And for me, if I'm going to teach, let's say, an English 282 Intro to Science writing course, writing in the sciences is different than writing in the humanities, right? You know, so we have different voice, we have different genres, and I like to use genre as a way of, in all my courses, a way of saying that these different forms of writing share characteristics across disciplines, but the dressing is different, right? We talk about horror films as a genre. We know what we expect to be in a horror film, but The Exorcist is radically different than Jaws, for instance. And so just like a building is going to have plumbing, electrical, heating and air, ventilation, you know, structural supports, the way the walls go up, the colors, the furniture, all that's going to be different at the time. So how can we understand what are the bones of a literature review, even if a lit review in English is going to be different than a lit review in education or a lit review in sciences? So trying to help connect transfer through function.
Students have to be successful in those next steps for writing, or what are some of the other very rigid blocks they make that transition into science writing, into something else, historical writing.
I think one of the biggest kind of constraints to students is vocabulary. To be honest, and it's not that students are not don't know these words, but these words take on different meanings in other contexts. So I would say for me, it would very much be vocabulary. Like analysis, as Sean was saying, students know how they know how to do it. But when we are placing it into this like academic context, that's new to them. So trying to figure out ways to get students to realize, like, oh, I did this in 106. Maybe I need to rethink about how I'm doing that. So getting not only students to rethink that, but also instructors to think about having students reflect back on those things. But also, I think it's very important for us as a university or a discipline to really come to understanding and come to terms, essentially, with what our terminology means, so that students are not having to be confused when the term audience is used in this way in 106, but it's used totally different in history. So in many ways, I think it's terminology.
Yeah, I remember talking with a history professor, not here, but just about what's valued in writing, and they said, well, we don't use a thesis in history writing. And as a writing person, I was like, well, yes, you do, but maybe you don't call it that, you know. So how do we help a student understand, like, well, I thought everything was driven by a thesis. Now my professor says we're not going to use a thesis, but this feels kind of like a thesis. So yeah, so it's beyond just the student too. The vocabulary pushes into fact.
And I would say even English faculty, we all don't agree on the same terminology in terms of what we are using in the classroom. So that's something we're trying to work on in Form 106, is making sure we come to a common terminology about whether or not we use like OSIE or taxes. Like, what are those formulas are we going to use to help students? So yeah, I would say coming to an understanding in terminology, and really that's on the faculty to really kind of create that understanding for students. Making sure faculty are aware of why they're using specific terms and what those specific terms mean, to then relay those to students.
The thing that I think is also hard about that is that with terms, students quickly interpret those as rules that are fixed and firm. And in the same way that kindergartners are told, don't start a sentence with and, that's just simply so that they don't have write sentence fragments. But there's nothing wrong with starting with and, you know. But students get here and it's a rule, right? I can't use the word I, so we get lots of kind of overwrought sentences. You know, the author of this essay believes, you know, instead of I. Right? So one of my concerns is that if we do codify, or if we do develop a shared terminology, that becomes so ingrained as now this is the only way. So that's one of the reasons I like the fact that we don't all do the same, recognizing it does cause some speech frustration. But I think it's because they're looking for the rule-based approach rather than flexible contextual approach.
One of my thoughts too is that when we ask students to write, often that also presupposes that we're asking them to read. It might be watch a film, but often read. And I find that for many students, especially based on their previous experience, they've found that that experience so labor intensive and cryptic that they are very adverse to engaging with the material. So for example, in an online course, I might say like, I want you to summarize this peer-reviewed journal article in a sentence. Here's the sentence template. Here's a 15-minute video of me showing you how I've used that template to develop a complete sentence. Here's an early draft. Here's a revised draft in alphabetic text underneath. And here's me reflecting on how it changed. And because Canvas has analytics, I can see stuff like, oh, they never watched the whole how-to video. And so I find that when it comes to teaching reading and writing, there's a whole ecology that often delays our students arriving to the task, where they feel so much pressure to accomplish the writing item that they're like, I don't have time to learn how to write. I just have to write it. And often as an instructor, that means that I have to include both a case for and time for revision, where I have to say, it's okay to do a rough draft just showing what you know before any instruction for this class. Now that you can see the difference between what you're capable of cold and what I'm asking you to do, please engage with this material. But that's very hard for them, right? Because even one of the things about English 104 is that it used to have 3 major papers. Now it has 2 because the class was so overburdened with content, frankly. And what I find is that for students, now that there's 1 less paper, they're not spending really more time on the remaining papers. They're saying this class is asking less of me, and now I have more time for other things that are not this class, which feels so frustrating, but also real and honest. So that's one of the things, like our students don't necessarily engage with a conversation with why we value writing. And so there's often a need to pause and really repeat that conversation again and again.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
the
I
end of
think
that
that,
thought.
oh, that's great. And I can hear Allison Bear clapping. But I think that to Derek's point about meta discourse and reflection, we can be so intentional through our prompts, the way that we invite students to think about their work and to have them interrogate the role of reading in that process. It's also hard when we talk about grades then, right? Because if we have the extrinsic reward of the grade, then everything else is a means to that end. And reading is just a means to getting the thing written, and writing is just a means to getting that grade.
Yeah.
So that's hard.
Although I'm finding it somewhat the opposite, because I say to my students, like, here's all of this low stakes writing. You can dump tons of points into this class if you just take 5 minutes and get these 5 points. And they're like, no, I don't have time for that. I'm just going to write the draft and hope it's good enough. Yeah.
Part of me also wonders kind of maybe rethinking a little bit about having students set intentions at the very beginning of the semester in terms of that, like what's your intention for this? Because we obviously are very intentional with our assignment development, our course outcomes. But maybe having the student clarify to themselves what their intention with this is, whether that's for a grade to get an A or whether it's for to learn how to write a literature. So, I'm thinking maybe a little bit more intention. That's something I can do better in my classroom, is definitely trying to make sure students set their own intentions. Like, why am I wanting to read this particular article? So for example, in the lit review, when I think about it, having a student set an intention for why they're reading this article over another. Like, what's your particular intention of reading this one versus something else? So having students set that up and then giving them kind of like a goal to work with at the starting point to be like, I want to read this one because this one looks more interesting in terms of its content. Great. Now read it and let's see if that's true. So I don't know, maybe more intentional. Again, this goes to transfer as well, more intentional and more transparent teaching, in the sense of getting students to define their own goals with why they want to do it. But again, it's very hard with that extrinsic reward of this is the grade you're going to.
Like what Courtney was describing, that writing is a finding skill, right? And I just have to do the thing without requiring on versus our knowledge of writing is the ongoing life journey as writers. So yeah, I don't have to. Before we wrap up, I have a couple of questions. One would be, I think it would be really interesting to work this presentation back to school in August, as all of our faculty are ready to start the semester. And maybe this right now is a kind of practice for that, like we work through it because what you're talking about is really important. I want a bigger audience, right? So that's one thing. I think I might. The second one is I was really intrigued by the way you described your target. 200 that you have for teaching online, or like doing our cares team, do what I do as site group. So like, is there some kind of something that we want to setting up for in terms of at the very least
A badge.
and a badge.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they're interested in that because right? It's just literally I think it's a problem to say it was Mary Marsh's and it was amazing, right? Because both of the other committee members were saying, how do we get everybody to write like and they're like they are asking me like what can we do to help the writing? This is something at one. The last one is your discussion about especially about the reasons and how the reasons look different. Something that was super helpful for our teachers. Nikki and I say that for whatever reason, some of them don't hear it, and we still have some teachers who are very disgruntled that, especially like when you do exchange with classes. Why does this person go? Right to say that the point is the synthesis, right? And it can look different. Package different for whatever.
Right. Why does a Toyota Tercel look different than a Volkswagen bus? Like they work the same way, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? This two things can be held in your head at the same time. We could use help.
Yeah, happy to help. Maybe even something with teaching partners, just mapping in a component for incoming teachers as they think about how do I get into the stickiness of assigning, working on grading.
Either in this part or
Yeah.
And I will say, speaking to the courses, there are stipends available for the faculty who take those particular courses. that's also available to those.
You can do that when it comes to not that's but other years they don't
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much.